Why Humans Shun War, Part 02. The council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Jiwan stepped forward. Around her, delegates from 40 different alien species waited to hear humanity's response. The Vrakti Empire had declared war 3 days ago, and everyone expected either panic or anger from the human representative. Instead, Jiwan looked calm, almost sad. The human government has received the Vrakti Declaration, she began, her voice steady. We reject your terms. However, we will not be fighting back. The chamber erupted in confused chatter. The Vrakti ambassador, a massive creature covered in thick armor plating, laughed loudly. You surrender then? Wise choice for such a weak species. Jiwan shook her head slowly. We do not surrender. We simply will not fight. Our people will evacuate all worlds in your projected path. We will offer no military resistance. This is not weakness. This is protection. Protection? The Vrakti ambassador's laughter grew louder. Protection from what? Our fleets? No, Jiwan replied quietly. Protection from ourselves. The alien delegates looked at each other in confusion. No one understood what the human meant. The Vrakti ambassador dismissed her words with a wave of his clawed hand. Cowards. We will take your worlds and make your people serve us. You have 1 month to evacuate. Jiwan gathered her documents and left the chamber. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face remained composed. She had done her part. Now others would have to do theirs. Halfway across the galaxy, Minho stood on the balcony of his apartment on New Haven. The colony world was beautiful, with purple skies and 3 moons. He had lived here for 15 years, raising his children in the peaceful colony. Now that peace was ending, his communication device buzzed. It was an official evacuation notice. All civilians had 2 weeks to board transport ships. The military would remain behind to coordinate the exodus, but there would be no defense preparations. Minho read the message twice, unable to believe it. He went down to the street where his neighbors were gathering. Everyone looked confused and angry. An older woman named Unji grabbed his arm. Did you see the message? They're abandoning the planet without a fight. I saw it, Minho replied. Maybe they have a plan we don't know about. What plan? Running away? A young man pushed forward through the crowd. My grandfather fought in the mining disputes on Titan. He said humans never ran from a fight. Minho wanted to correct him but stopped. The young man was wrong about human history, but how could Minho explain something he barely understood himself? The truth was, humans hadn't fought a real war in over 300 years. Most people had forgotten why. At the military command center on the edge of the city, Colonel Hijin watched the evacuation schedules on multiple screens. Her staff worked efficiently, coordinating transport routes and supply distribution. Not a single person was preparing weapons or defensive positions. A junior officer approached her desk. Colonel, the civilian administrator Minho is requesting a meeting. He wants to know about our defensive strategy. Hijin sighed. She had been expecting this. Send him in. Minho entered the office a few minutes later. He tried to stay polite, but his frustration was obvious. Colonel, can you tell me why we're not defending this planet? We have nearly 4 million people here. Doesn't that mean anything? Hijin gestured for him to sit. Mr. Minho, we are defending those people. By evacuating them. That's not defense, that's retreat. Is it? Hijin leaned back in her chair. Tell me, what do you know about human military history? Minho frowned. I know we've been peaceful for centuries. I know we have a strong economy and good relationships with most alien species. I know we prefer diplomacy to violence. That's what most people know, Hijin said. But do you know why we prefer diplomacy? Because violence is wrong? Hijin shook her head. Because we're too good at it. Minho stared at her, not understanding. The colonel stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city below. 300 years ago, humanity fought its last war. We called it the Last Tuesday. It lasted 16 hours. 2 billion people died. Entire continents became radioactive wastelands. The war didn't end because one side won. It ended because both sides simultaneously realized they were about to make the human species extinct. She turned back to face Minho. After that day, humanity made a choice. We would dismantle our weapons. We would erase our combat doctrines. We would forget how to wage war. Not because we were weak, but because we had become too efficient at killing. But that was 300 years ago, Minho protested. Surely we need some defense capability. We kept some things, Hijin admitted. Enough to remind us why we must never go back. But we sealed away the truly dangerous knowledge. The weapons, the tactics, the mindset that made the last Tuesday possible. She paused. We're not preparing to fight the Vrakti because fighting is not the answer. We're preparing not to fight them, which is much harder. Minho left the meeting more confused than when he entered. He walked through the city streets watching families pack their belongings. Children played in the parks, not understanding the gravity of the situation. Their parents tried to stay calm, but fear showed in their eyes. On Earth, in a secure facility deep underground, Dr. Suman accessed files that hadn't been opened in decades. Her assignment was simple but heavy: review humanity's military history and prepare a brief for the Galactic Council. They wanted to understand why humans refused to fight. The first files made her uncomfortable. They detailed conflicts from the early 21st century, wars fought with conventional weapons. The casualty numbers seemed high but manageable. Then she reached the mid-21st century files: chemical weapons, biological agents, targeted genetic plagues. The numbers grew exponentially. By the late 21st century, the files became horrifying. Humanity had developed weapons that could destroy entire planets. Not slowly, but in minutes. She read tactical manuals that discussed acceptable civilian casualties in the billions. She saw combat footage of cities vanishing in microseconds, reduced to atomic vapor. Then she reached the files about the last Tuesday. Her hands shook as she read the after-action reports. The war had started over a trade dispute between two economic blocs. Within 4 hours, both sides had deployed their full arsenals: quantum disruption weapons, planet cracker missiles, self-replicating combat drones programmed to kill anything with human DNA. The war ended when a junior officer on one side and a ship captain on the other simultaneously refused their orders to launch the final wave of weapons. These two individuals, who never met, saved humanity from extinction. The casualty count stopped at 2 billion instead of 8 billion. Dr. Suman closed the files and sat in the dark archive room. She understood now why the government refused to fight the Vrakti. It wasn't about being peaceful or moral. It was about fear. Humanity was terrified of what they might become if they started fighting again. She began writing her report, choosing each word carefully. The Galactic Council needed to understand. Humans didn't shun war because they were weak. They shunned war because they remembered what they were capable of when they stopped holding back. Above ground, the sun set over Earth's capital city. President Daiho stood at his window, watching the crowds gathered in the streets. They were protesting, demanding action against the Vrakti invasion. They wanted their government to fight back, to defend human dignity and territory. He understood their anger, but he also understood what they didn't. Sometimes the bravest thing wasn't fighting. Sometimes the bravest thing was choosing not to fight, even when everything in you wanted to unleash hell on your enemies. The Vrakti thought humans were cowards. Let them think that. It was better than showing them the truth. Why Humans Shun War. Part 02. The first execution broadcast went live across the galaxy at dawn on New Haven. Warlord Thexnor wanted everyone to see what happened to humans who resisted. He had his soldiers round up 100 civilians from the streets and bring them to the central plaza. Minho watched from a hidden location, forced to witness what his resistance had caused. The Vrakti didn't execute people quickly or painlessly. They made it a spectacle, designed to break the spirit of anyone watching. The broadcast reached Earth within minutes. People gathered in public spaces, watching in horror as their fellow humans died. The crowds that had protested for action now protested for different reasons. Some demanded the government negotiate. Others demanded revenge. President Daiho called an emergency meeting with his council. Dr. Suman had returned with her report on the weapons, and now that report sat on the table like a loaded gun. 800 functional missiles, General Yuna summarized. Enough firepower to destroy the entire Vrakti warfleet currently in our space. Along with any planets or stations they're near, Dr. Suman added quietly. Hell-class missiles don't have precision targeting. They're designed for area destruction. President Daiho looked exhausted. He had barely slept since the occupation began. Now he faced the hardest decision any human leader had faced in 3 centuries. How many people will die in the culling if we do nothing? Current estimates suggest 10,000 per day until resistance ends, replied his intelligence advisor. The Vrakti have demonstrated this tactic before. Based on Torvan historical data, the culling typically lasts between 30 and 60 days. Total casualties would be between 300,000 and 600,000 people. The number sat heavy in the room. 500,000 people killed slowly to break humanity's will. And if we use the missiles? The president asked. General Yuna pulled up tactical projections. Best case scenario, we destroy their war fleet with minimal collateral damage. The Vrakti withdraw. We save most of our people in the occupied zones. And worst case? The general hesitated. Worst case, we successfully use the missiles. Win the tactical engagement and remember that we know how to wage war. The psychological barrier is broken. Next time there's a conflict, using weapons seems more acceptable. Then more acceptable. Within a generation, we're back to where we were before the last Tuesday. Former Lieutenant Junho, who had been invited to the meeting because of his experience with the combat simulations, spoke up. Sir, I've seen the tactical doctrines. They're designed to escalate. That's how our ancestors thought. Start with conventional weapons, then chemical, then biological, then nuclear, then the quantum weapons. Each level became acceptable because the previous level was already broken. So we let our people die, said Advisor Young-ho bitterly. Because we're afraid of ourselves? Yes, President Daeho said simply. That's exactly what we do. The room erupted in argument. Half the council believed using the missiles was justified. The other half believed it would doom humanity in the long term. The debate raged for hours, getting nowhere. Finally, Colonel Hijin proposed an alternative. We don't use the weapons, but we show them. Everyone turned to her. The Vrakti think we're weak because we won't fight. Other species are beginning to think the same thing. What if we showed them what we're capable of without actually using it against anyone? A demonstration? Ambassador Jiwon considered the idea. But demonstrating those missiles would just prove we have weapons. No. Hyejin shook her head. We demonstrate something bigger. We show them why we chose to stop fighting. We broadcast our entire military history, unedited to the entire galaxy. Let them see what humanity was, what we became, and what we chose to turn away from. Dr. Suman felt a chill. You want to show them the last Tuesday? Everything. The escalation. The casualties. The weapons. The moment we looked at ourselves and chose peace. Hyejin looked at the president. Let the Vrakti and every other species understand. We don't shun war because we're weak. We shun it because we're terrified of what we become when we stop holding back. The idea was radical. Humanity had kept its dark history mostly classified, sharing only sanitized versions with the galactic community. Showing the full truth would be admitting to atrocities that made most species' worst wars look gentle by comparison. They'll fear us, Young-ho predicted. Good, General Yuna replied. Fear is better than contempt. Right now, the Vrakti think humans are easy prey. Let them understand what they're actually dealing with. President Daeho made his decision. Prepare the broadcast, everything, no censorship, no editing. Let the galaxy see who we really are. The broadcast was scheduled for the following day, giving the galactic media time to prepare. Every species with communication technology would receive the transmission. It would be the most watched event in recorded history. Dr. Suman was put in charge of compiling the material. She worked through the night, selecting footage and documents that told humanity's story. She started with early wars, conflicts fought with primitive weapons over land and resources. The casualties seemed almost quaint compared to what came later. Then she added the industrialized warfare of the 20th and 21st centuries. Mechanized death on a scale never seen before. The development of nuclear weapons. The Cold War, where humanity came close to extinction but pulled back. Then came the 22nd century, when humanity truly became terrifying. Genetic weapons that targeted specific populations. Nanotech weapons that dissolved enemy infrastructure at the molecular level. Self-replicating combat drones that hunted their targets for years. She included training materials, tactical manuals, after-action reports. Everything that showed how humanity had systematized warfare, turned it into a science, optimized it for maximum efficiency. The centerpiece was the last Tuesday. She included satellite footage of entire cities vanishing. She included casualty reports that clicked upward like racing timers. She included communication recordings of officers calmly discussing acceptable losses in the billions. She also included the moment it ended, the junior officer who refused her launch order, the ship captain who disabled his weapons, the cascade of refusals that stopped the war, the aftermath footage of survivors wandering through radioactive wastelands. Finally, She included the treaty humanity made with itself, the agreement to dismantle all weapons, the psychological counseling programs that helped soldiers forget their training, the education reforms that emphasized cooperation over competition, the 300 years of peace that followed. When she finished, she watched the complete presentation. It ran 4 hours long. By the end, she was crying. Not because of the horror, though there was plenty, but because of the choice. Humanity had looked at the worst version of itself and consciously decided to become something better. On New Haven, Minho heard about the planned broadcast through secret channels. He didn't understand what good it would do. The Vrakti were already killing people. More would die tomorrow. How would showing them old videos change anything? Thexvor, the Vrakti officer overseeing the occupation, also heard about the broadcast. He was curious. His intelligence officers had been trying to understand human psychology for months. Maybe this would provide insights. He gathered his command staff to watch the broadcast together. They expected propaganda, carefully edited images designed to make humans look strong. What they got was something entirely different. The broadcast began simply. This is what we were. This is what we became. This is why we chose to stop. For 4 hours, the Vrakti command staff watched humanity's history of warfare unfold. At first, they were dismissive. The early wars looked primitive to a species that had mastered interstellar combat. Then came the 22nd century material. The Vrakti officers fell silent. They watched humans deploy weapons that made their own arsenal look crude. They watched tactics that prioritized enemy annihilation over victory, that treated civilian casualties as tactical advantages, that optimized for maximum death with minimum resource expenditure. One of Thexvor's subordinates spoke up halfway through. This can't be real. No species fights like this, but it was real. The documentation was too detailed, too authentic to be fabricated. This was actual human military doctrine, taught to millions of soldiers used in actual combat. When the last Tuesday footage played, the Vrakti Command Center became absolutely silent. They watched 2 billion humans die in 16 hours. They watched weapons tear apart the fabric of reality itself. They watched humanity bring itself to the edge of extinction through sheer military efficiency. Then came the aftermath. The treaty. The choice. The broadcast ended with a simple message. We shun war not because we cannot fight. We shun war because we remember what we are when we do. The Vrakti invasion will not change this. We will die before we become monsters again. This is not weakness. This is the hardest choice we ever made. Thexvor sat in darkness after the broadcast ended, his mind racing. His entire culture was built on warrior values. Strength through combat. Honor through victory. The Vrakti had conquered dozens of species and considered themselves the galaxy's greatest military power. But humanity had weapons the Vrakti couldn't even imagine. Tactics that treated warfare as a science of death, and they had chosen to abandon all of it. He thought about the culling scheduled to continue tomorrow. Why Humans Shun War. Part 02. The Vrakti war fleet arrived at New Haven exactly on schedule. Their ships filled the sky, massive vessels designed to intimidate as much as destroy. Commander Borum watched from the observation deck of the last evacuation transport. His home for 15 years was about to fall, and he couldn't do anything except watch. The Vrakti broadcast their message on all frequencies. Humans of New Haven, your cowardly leaders have abandoned you. Any who remain will become property of the Vrakti Empire. Surrender now and accept your new place as servants. Borum clenched his fists. The transport was carrying 30,000 refugees, one of the last ships to leave. Below, the city stood empty. Homes abandoned, businesses locked up, parks silent. The Vrakti would find a ghost planet. It doesn't feel right, said a woman standing next to him. She held a small child in her arms. Running away like this. Borum wanted to agree with her, but he remembered something Colonel Hyagen had said during the evacuation briefing. We're not running away. We're denying them what they want. They came for a fight and found nothing to fight against. That's just fancy words for cowardice, the woman replied bitterly. The transport jumped to faster than light speed, and New Haven disappeared from view. Borum sat down heavily, exhausted from weeks of coordinating the evacuation. He had done his duty, but it felt hollow. His military training screamed at him to fight, but his orders were clear. No resistance. No engagement. Just evacuate and wait. On Earth, President Deho faced a very different kind of battle. The public was furious. Protests filled every major city. People demanded action, demanded that the military defend human territory. Some protests turned violent, with crowds attempting to storm government buildings. He called an emergency broadcast to address the entire human population. His communication team advised him to be strong and reassuring. Instead, he decided to be honest. "My fellow humans," he began, his face appearing on billions of screens across human space. "I understand your anger. I feel it too. The Vrakti have invaded our territory, occupied our worlds, and insulted our dignity. Every instinct tells us to fight back, to show them they made a mistake." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I must tell you why we cannot do that. Not will not. Cannot." The president touched a control and images appeared behind him. Ancient images from 300 years ago. This is what we were. This is what we became when we stopped holding back. The footage showed burning cities, weapons of unimaginable power, casualty reports with numbers that seemed impossible. People watching the broadcast fell silent, many seeing these images for the first time. "We built weapons that could end worlds," Deho continued. "We created tactics that treated genocide as a math problem to be solved. We became so good at killing that we nearly killed ourselves. 2 billion people died in 16 hours during our last war. 16 hours, he let that number hang in the air. After the last Tuesday, humanity made a choice. We would dismantle everything that made that day possible. We would forget how to be monsters. And for 300 years, we succeeded." The president's voice grew heavy. "The Vrakti think we're weak because we won't fight. They're wrong. We're not weak. We're terrified. Terrified of what we might become if we start down that path again." Across human space, people watched in stunned silence. Many had never known the full details of the last Tuesday. The government had kept the worst information classified, believing that forgetting was the only way to move forward. But one person was not convinced by the president's words. Lieutenant Junho was young, born long after the last Tuesday, and he couldn't accept his government's surrender. He met with other young officers in a secret location, an abandoned warehouse in Tokyo. 300 years of peace made us soft, he told the gathered group of about 50 officers and soldiers. "Our ancestors would be ashamed of us." A woman named Hana spoke up. "What do you suggest we do? Disobey direct orders?" "I suggest we remember what it means to be human," Junho replied. "We're not sheep. We are not cowards. If the government won't defend our worlds, then we will." He revealed that he had found the location of several old military storage facilities. They were supposed to be empty, weapons long ago destroyed, but Junho suspected that some things had been kept, hidden away for emergencies. Over the next 2 weeks, his group raided 3 facilities. They found mostly empty vaults, but in the third location, they discovered something that had been overlooked. It wasn't a weapon, but something potentially more dangerous: training simulations from the war era. Junho brought the simulation programs back to their hideout and loaded them onto a secure system. The first simulation he ran was labeled Basic Frigate Tactics Introduction Level. The program started innocently enough. It showed a single human frigate encountering an enemy fleet. The simulation asked Junho to plan his attack strategy. He input what he thought were reasonable tactics: disable the enemy command ship, force the fleet to scatter, claim victory with minimal casualties. The simulation rejected his plan. Inefficient. Probability of enemy regrouping 67%. Acceptable civilian casualties on nearby station 0. This approach violates optimal doctrine. Junho frowned and tried again, this time being more aggressive. The simulation accepted his second plan but graded it poorly. Then it showed him the optimal solution. What happened next made Junho's blood run cold. The simulation's recommended tactic was to immediately target the nearby civilian station. Not as collateral damage, but as the primary target. Destroy the station, which would create a debris field. Use the debris to mask the frigate's approach. While the enemy fleet was distracted by the civilian casualties, destroy their ships one by one with precision strikes. Estimated enemy casualties, 100%. Estimated civilian casualties, 47,000. Time to complete engagement, 12 minutes. Efficiency rating, excellent. Junho sat back horrified. This was a basic training simulation. Introduction level. and it treated killing nearly 50,000 civilians as an acceptable tactic. He ran another simulation, then another. Each one was worse than the last. The programs didn't see civilians and combatants. They just saw targets and acceptable losses. Every scenario optimized for maximum enemy destruction with minimum resource expenditure. One simulation demonstrated how a single frigate could sterilize a planet. Not with massive weapons, but with careful targeting of atmosphere processors and orbital strikes on tectonic weak points. Total time 47 minutes. Estimated planetary casualties 100%. Resources required minimal. Hana, who had been watching over his shoulder, turned away and was sick. This is what we were? This is what our military considered normal? Hunyo continued through the simulations, unable to stop. He found doctrines for biological warfare, genetic targeting, quantum disruption weapons, self-replicating combat drones. He found tactical manuals that discussed turning enemy planets into weapons against their own fleets and with a bomb. Final simulation he accessed was labeled The Last Tuesday, actual combat record classified. He almost didn't run it, but his finger pressed the button before he could stop himself. The simulation wasn't theoretical. It was real footage recorded during the last human war. The war started at 06 Gore Universal Time. By 08 Fars, both sides had deployed chemical weapons. By 10 and biological agents were in use. By 14 our nuclear weapons were flying. By 18 the quantum disruption weapons were activated. Junho watched cities of millions vanish in seconds. He watched as automated defense systems, unable to distinguish between military and civilian targets, began killing indiscriminately. He watched as both sides' command structures broke down, and individual ships' captains made their own decisions about weapon deployment. He watched the moment at 22 Gaudunes when a junior officer named Suman refused her launch order. Her commander threatened to execute her. She accepted death rather than fire her weapons. Her act of defiance started a cascade. Other officers refused orders. Captains disabled their own weapon systems. The war stopped not because anyone won, but because people on both sides simultaneously chose to stop. The final casualty report appeared on screen. 147, 483, 647 dead. That number represented approximately 1/4 of humanity's population at the time. Junho turned off the simulation and sat in darkness. His hands were shaking. Around him, his volunteers were equally shaken. They had come here wanting to fight, believing that their government was wrong to surrender. Now they understood. "We have to destroy these files," Hana whispered. "If anyone else sees this, if anyone thinks this is acceptable." "The government already knows," Junho replied quietly. "They've known for 300 years. That's why they won't fight. Not because they can't. Because they remember what happens when they do." He looked at his volunteers, young officers who had thought war was glorious and necessary. Now they knew the truth. War wasn't glorious. It was efficient. Calculated genocide dressed up in tactical language. "What do we do now?" someone asked. Junho deleted the simulation files and stood up. "We follow our orders. We don't fight the Vrakti. Because if we start fighting, if we remember how to do this, we won't be able to stop." The volunteer force disbanded that night. They had come together wanting to be heroes. They left understanding why their government was so desperate to avoid being monsters. On New Haven, the first Vrakti troops landed to find empty cities waiting for them. HFY humans, Shun War. Part 02, 3 months into the occupation, Warlord Thexner was discovering that conquering humans and governing them were completely different challenges. His forces had occupied 7 human colony worlds without firing a single shot. They had expected either resistance or cooperation. What they got was something the Vrakti had never encountered before: organized incompetence. On New Haven, Minho had not evacuated with the others. He had volunteered to stay behind as part of a small civilian group that would maintain essential services during the occupation. The Vrakti needed someone to run the power plants, water systems, and food production facilities. They assumed humans would cooperate to keep themselves alive. They were wrong. The power grid mysteriously developed problems. Not failures, just problems. Voltage fluctuations that were never quite severe enough to cause damage, but made Vrakti equipment unreliable. Minho would apologize profusely each time, explaining that the systems were old and needed constant maintenance. "We're working on it," he would say with an earnest expression. "These things take time. The water treatment plants had similar issues. The water was always safe to drink, but sometimes it tasted odd. Not bad enough to be poison, just unpleasant enough to be annoying. The Vrakti would complain, and the human technicians would nod and promise to fix it. The food production facilities were the worst. The automated farms kept producing food, but somehow the Vrakti supplies were always last in the queue. When asked why, the human managers would pull up confusing spreadsheets and explain complex distribution algorithms that made sense, but somehow always resulted in delays. A Vrakti officer named HFY was assigned to oversee the civilian workforce. After 2 months of escalating frustration, he summoned Minho to his command post. "You are sabotaging our operations," HFY accused. Minho looked genuinely hurt. "Sir, we're doing our best. These systems are complicated. Perhaps if your people helped us." "We tried. Your systems don't make sense." "They make perfect sense to us," Minho replied. "We've been using them for years without problems." HFY wanted to hit the human but restrained himself. "Before we arrived, these systems worked fine. Now everything is broken." "Yes, sir. That's because your people keep changing things. The power grid is calibrated for human equipment. Your devices draw power differently. It creates instabilities." It was a plausible explanation. Too plausible. HFY suspected the human was lying but couldn't prove it. Every excuse had just enough truth to be believable. This was happening across all occupied worlds. The Vrakti were learning that humans were masters of passive resistance. They didn't fight. They didn't sabotage in obvious ways. They just became incredibly frustratingly incompetent. Communication networks would lag just enough to make real-time coordination difficult. Traffic management systems would route Vrakti vehicles through the longest possible paths. Environmental controls would keep buildings just slightly too cold or too warm for Vrakti comfort. None of it was bad enough to justify executions. All of it was maddening. On Earth, Ambassador G1 received a secret visitor. The meeting took place in a secure location, swept for listening devices. Her visitor was unexpected, a Torvan admiral named Kexis. The Torvan were a reptilian species that had once been neighbors with the Vrakti. They had fought a brutal war decades ago and lost. Now they lived under Vrakti economic dominance. Not quite conquered, but certainly not free. Ambassador Kexis began without preamble. "I come with a warning and an offer." G1 gestured for him to continue. "The Vrakti are planning what they call the culling. When passive resistance becomes too frustrating, they begin executing civilians to break morale. They did it to my people. They will do it to yours." G1 felt her stomach tighten. "When? Soon, within weeks. Warlord Thexnor is already losing patience with your people's tactics." The Torvan admiral pulled out a data device. "But I also bring opportunity. 10 years ago, our salvage teams found a derelict ship in dead space. It was human in design, very old. The crew was long dead, but some of the cargo remained intact." He activated the device, showing images of sleek missiles in pristine condition. "We didn't know what they were at first. Our weapons experts eventually identified them as human military hardware. Pre-peace era. Something called Hell-class fusion missiles." G1 stood up abruptly. "Those should have been destroyed centuries ago. But they weren't. And now they exist." Kexis met her eyes. "The Torvan government is willing to return these weapons to humanity. In exchange, we ask that you use them to defeat the Vrakti. Free our people as you free yours." "We don't use weapons anymore," G1 said firmly. "Then thousands of your people will die in the culling," Kexis replied. "The choice is yours, Ambassador. Your principles or your people." He left the data device and departed. G1 stared at the device for a long time before finally picking it up and taking it to President Deho. The president assembled his security council to view the Torvan evidence. Dr. Suman was brought in as the expert on historical weapon systems. When she saw the images, her face went pale. "These are authentic," she confirmed. Hell-class missiles were standard armament for human cruisers during the late war period. Each one carries a fusion warhead capable of destroying a medium-sized city. "Can they still function?" asked General Yuna. "Possibly. The design was very stable. If they've been preserved in the vacuum of space, the mechanisms could still work." Suman pulled up technical specifications. "But that's not the real danger." She changed the display to show deployment doctrine. Hell-class missiles weren't designed to be used individually. The tactical manual called for saturation bombardment. Launch hundreds at once, overwhelm enemy defenses, ensure total destruction of the target area. How many did we typically carry? President Deho asked. A single cruiser would carry 500 missiles. Suman replied quietly. The derelict ship in the images appears to be a heavy cruiser. If its magazines are full, there could be up to 800 missiles on board. The room fell silent. 800 city-killer weapons floating in dead space, now in Torvan hands and being offered back to humanity. We need to destroy them, Ji-won said firmly. Immediately. Or we could use them, suggested a civilian advisor named Young-ho. Not on civilians, but on military targets. The Vrakti Warfleet. We could end the occupation in days. No, General Yuna said flatly. The ambassador is right. These weapons need to be destroyed. Even if it means our people die in the culling, Young-ho challenged. The question hung in the air. President Deho looked at each person in the room. Some wanted to use the weapons, others wanted them destroyed. All of them were afraid. Dr. Suman, the president said, you'll travel to the derelict ship and verify the weapon's status. If they're functional, document everything. We'll make our decision based on your report. Suman wanted to refuse, but this was her duty. She had spent months studying humanity's dark past. Now she would have to face it physically. 2 weeks later, she arrived at the coordinates provided by the Torvan. The derelict ship hung in the darkness of deep space, a ghost from another era. Its hull bore the name Indomitable, a proud name from a time when humanity believed strength came from weapons. Suman boarded with a small team of technicians. The ship's interior was frozen, perfectly preserved by the vacuum of space. They found the crew in their stations dead for centuries, killed by some malfunction that left the ship intact but everyone aboard dead. The missile magazines were in the aft section. Suman approached them with growing dread. The missiles sat in their launch tubes, exactly as they had been loaded 300 years ago. Each one was painted with kill markers, showing how many times it had been used in simulations and training exercises. She ran diagnostic tests on 3 random missiles. All 3 showed green status lights. They were ready to fire. Her team member, a young engineer named Taiwu, looked at the weapons with something like awe. These could win the war for us. There is no war, Suman corrected. There's an occupation. And using these wouldn't win anything. It would just remind us how to lose our humanity. She completed her documentation and returned to her ship. As they pulled away from the derelict, Taiwu asked, "What do you think the president will decide?" Suman didn't answer. She honestly didn't know. The weapons existed, functional and ready. The culling was coming and thousands would die. The temptation to use the missiles must be enormous. But she also knew what those weapons represented. They weren't just tools of war. They were symbols of the mindset that had nearly destroyed humanity. Using them wouldn't just be a tactical decision. It would be the first step back toward becoming the monsters they had sworn never to be again. Back on occupied New Haven, Minho received a message through secret channels. The culling was scheduled to begin in 1 week. 10,000 humans would be executed daily until the resistance ended and cooperation began. He gathered his fellow resistors in a hidden location. They had been so proud of their passive resistance, their ability to frustrate the Vrakti without violence. Now that resistance was about to cost thousands of lives. "We should stop," said Yunji, the older woman who had been one of his first recruits. "If we cooperate, they'll stop the executions. If we cooperate..." Why Humans Shun War? Part Jou Warlord Thexanor dismissed Thexavor's report without a second thought. In his command ship orbiting New Haven, the supreme leader of the Vrakti invasion force watched the human broadcast with contempt rather than concern. "Propaganda," he announced to his assembled officers. "They show us what they used to be, not what they are. This proves only that they were once strong and became weak. These weapons they show? Abandoned. These tactics? Forgotten. They have nothing now except memories." His officers weren't all convinced, but none dared contradict him. Thexnor had built his career on never backing down, never showing doubt. To him, the human broadcast was a desperate bluff by a species with no other options. He increased the culling schedule, 20,000 executions per day now. He wanted to break human resistance quickly and move on to more profitable conquests. On New Haven, Minho watched as the death toll climbed. The broadcast had changed nothing. The Vrakti were killing people faster now, as if trying to prove they weren't afraid of humanity's past. Yet something was different. The Vrakti soldiers carrying out the execution seemed uncomfortable. They followed orders, but Minho noticed hesitation that hadn't been there before. Some of the younger soldiers looked haunted. Thexivor was struggling with his own doubts. He had sent his report and been ignored. Now he was expected to oversee increased executions of people who refused to fight back. His warrior culture taught that honor came from combat against worthy opponents. But the humans weren't opponents. They were victims, and that distinction bothered him more each day. He began studying the human broadcast in detail, particularly the tactical manuals and weapons specifications. His military training compelled him to analyze the threat. What he found disturbed him deeply. The Hell-class missiles that Dr. Suman had documented were marked as light ordnance in human tactical doctrine. Light, that meant there were weapons humanity considered heavy ordnance that made city-killer missiles seem minor. He found references to planet cracker weapons, quantum disruption devices, self-replicating combat systems. He found casualty optimization algorithms that calculated acceptable civilian deaths in decimal percentages of total planetary populations. One document particularly caught his attention: the deterrence equation. It was a mathematical framework that calculated when total war became necessary. The equation factored in enemy military capacity, civilian population as military resources, and acceptable loss ratios for both sides. The equation assumed that in total war, there were no civilians. Everyone was a target. The only question was which targets provided the best return on resource investment. Thexivor ran the equation using current Vrakti Empire numbers. The results made him physically ill. If humanity reverted to this doctrine and used it against the Vrakti, the Empire would cease to exist. Not defeated, extinct. The equation optimized for complete destruction of enemy capacity to wage war, which meant destroying the enemy's ability to reproduce and rebuild. He tried to tell himself this was just theoretical mathematics, ancient history, but the equation was too elegant, too precise. It had clearly been used in real combat scenarios. Human military planners had once made life and death decisions based on these calculations. That night, Thexivor did something that could get him executed for treason. He contacted Ambassador Jiwan through secret channels and requested a meeting. They met in a neutral location, a defunct industrial facility between the occupied city and the spaceport. Jiwan arrived with 2 guards. Thexivor came alone, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "Why did you contact me?" Jiwan asked, her voice cold. This Vrakti officer was overseeing the executions of her people. "Because I need to understand," Thexivor replied. "Your broadcast showed weapons and tactics that should make you the most feared species in the galaxy. Yet you chose to abandon them. Why?" "We already explained that." "No, you explained what happened. I want to understand why you made that choice. My culture values strength through combat. Everything I was taught says your decision was weakness. But after studying your tactical doctrine, I don't believe you are weak. So why?" Jiwan studied him carefully. This could be a trap. But something in the Vrakti officer's manner suggested genuine confusion. She decided to be honest. "Have you ever done something you couldn't take back?" she asked. "Something so terrible that you couldn't live with yourself afterward?" Thexivor thought about some of his own combat experiences. Yes. Now imagine an entire species feeling that way simultaneously. 2 billion dead in one day. Not enemies. Our own people killed by our own weapons. We looked at what we'd done and realized we had become something monstrous. She continued. The weapons weren't the problem. The problem was what the weapons allowed us to be. They made killing so efficient that we stopped seeing it as killing. It became resource management, population reduction, acceptable losses. We optimized genocide. Thexivor listened intently. After the last Tuesday, humanity faced a choice. We could keep the weapons and promise to never use them again. But we knew that wouldn't work. Because weapons exist to be used. Eventually, some conflict would justify using them. And once we used them once, using them again would be easier. So we chose to destroy everything. Not just the weapons, but the knowledge, the training, the mindset. We chose to forget how to be monsters. But you haven't forgotten, Thexivor pointed out. I've seen your tactical manuals. The knowledge still exists. We kept enough to remember why we stopped, Jiwan admitted. Enough to remind us what we were capable of. But we stopped training new generations in those tactics. We stopped thinking of warfare as an acceptable solution. It's been 300 years. The people who knew how to wage war efficiently are all dead. So you really would accept extinction rather than fight? G1 met his eyes. Yes, because if we fight the way we know how to fight, we won't just defeat you. We'll annihilate you. Your species, your culture, your history, all erased. And then we'll become the monsters again. We can't live with ourselves as monsters, so we'd rather die as people. The conversation was interrupted by alarms. Warlord Thexnor had discovered Thexvor's unauthorized meeting. Soldiers were coming. Jiwan and her guards fled while Thexvor was arrested and dragged before the warlord. Traitor, Thexnor accused. Speaking with the enemy. Planning surrender. Not surrender, Thexvor replied. Understanding. We need to understand what we're dealing with. We're dealing with cowards who won't fight back. That's all we need to understand. Thexvor knew his career was over, possibly his life. He had nothing left to lose. You're wrong. They're not cowards. They're terrified. Of themselves. He pulled out his analysis of human tactical doctrine. I studied their weapons. I ran their strategic calculations. If humans decide to fight, we don't win. Nobody wins. They have contingency plans for mutual extinction scenarios, plans they developed and actually considered using. Thexnor looked at the data but remained unconvinced. Ancient history. They don't have these weapons anymore. They have the knowledge to rebuild them. That's worse. Because if they rebuild, they won't stop at defense. Their doctrine calls for total enemy neutralization, empty threats. Are they? Thexvor challenged. We've killed nearly 1 million of them. They haven't fought back. Not because they can't, but because they're holding themselves back. What happens when they stop holding back? What happens when the fear of what they might become is less than the reality of what we're doing to them? Thexnor hesitated. For the first time, doubt crept into his certainty. Back on Earth, President Deho was dealing with his own crisis. The broadcast had achieved some of what they wanted. Other alien species now understood that humanity's pacifism came from strength, not weakness. But it hadn't stopped the Vrakti. The culling continued. Worse, there was a growing movement among humans to reactivate military production. Young people like Junho, who had disbanded his volunteer force, were being pressured to reform. People argued that understanding why humanity stopped fighting wasn't enough. They needed to fight now to survive. Dr. Suman presented new intelligence. The Torvan have shared additional information about the derelict ship. They found more than just missiles. There's an intact weapons fabrication facility on board. Automated, it could produce combat drones within weeks. Absolutely not, General Yuna said immediately. We're dying, argued Advisor Youngho. 1 million dead and counting. At what point does our commitment to peace become suicide? When we break our commitment to peace, it won't be suicide, Colonel Heejin replied. It'll be murder. We won't just fight the Vrakti. We'll destroy them. Then we'll look for the next threat. Then the next. War doesn't end with one battle. It ends when everyone is dead. The debate continued, but President Deho noticed something. The arguments for fighting were getting stronger. People who had firmly opposed military action were now considering it. The psychological barrier was eroding. That was how it started last time. Small compromises. Just this once. Just for defense. Then just for prevention. Then just for security. Until just became always and sometimes became doctrine. He made an executive decision. No weapons. No combat systems. No matter how many die. This is humanity's line. We don't cross it. The decision was unpopular, but it held, barely.